Hello learners, and welcome to today's lesson of lines, angles and intersecting lines. Let's start off our lesson with a did you know? So, did you know that a line has one dimension only, length? The length of a line is infinite. That is, a line extends indefinitely in two opposite directions. Only a part of a line, called a line segment, has a finite length. You will learn more about lines and line segments in this lesson. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify and differentiate between the different pairs of angles, namely adjacent angles, vertically opposite angles, and complementary and supplementary angles. You should also be able to write clear descriptions of the relationship between angles formed by intersecting lines. Let's look at the concept map for our lesson today. So as we'll be focusing on lines, angles, and intersecting lines, we will look at line orientations, where we are going to look at the vertical lines, horizontal lines, and inclined or sloping lines. Then we are going to look at pairs of angles, where we are going to look at vertically opposite angles, adjacent angles, complementary angles, and supplementary angles. Then lastly, we are going to look at properties of angles, where we are going to look at the properties for vertically opposite angles, those for angles on a straight line, and angles around a point. So let's see what pre-knowledge you must have for this lesson. So for this lesson, you should be able to define an angle, identify types of angles, and describe the different types of angles. So let's look at some practice knowledge. So there we have an angle, and an angle here is defined as a measure of rotation. So an angle is formed if two lines, rays, or line segments with different inclinations intersect. So as we can see there, we have an initial arm, and that initial arm now then has a terminal arm. So when that terminal arm rotates, it rotates there by the vertex. And that's how an angle is formed. So when the terminal arm moves from the initial arm and starts rotating at the vertex, it forms an angle. So that right there is an angle. And of course, there are different types of angles over there. As we can see here with a PQR, we can see the angle Q there, where we have our initial arm and we have our terminal arm, and they are forming an angle there because they are intersecting there at the vertex of Q. Then, of course, again, we have different types of angles, like the one that we are looking at now, where we can see that the angle is being formed there at T, where we have the initial arm TR and we have that terminal arm TS. And of course, this terminal arm can go all the way around. So from the initial arm, and it goes all the way around, almost all the way around back to the initial arm, but forming an angle outside there. Also, it's that arm rotating at that vertex there. Let's look at more of these angles and see how we can describe each of these angles. So when we are looking at a full circle or a revolution, how many degrees does it take to complete a revolution? So from that initial arm, we are at, of course, 0 degrees. But once the terminal arm starts moving, it moves along the circle and it starts forming those angles. So when it gets to that point there, it will be at a 90 degrees. And when it continues to move along and gets to that point there, it will be at 180 degrees, and it continues moving. It will be at 270 degrees, and of course, back at 360 degrees, which then now gives us our revolution, a full circle. So there we have it, from our initial arm of 0, if it goes all the way around to 180 degrees, we can see how it forms a straight line. So a straight line we can see forms 180 degrees. Then we have, of course, a right angle, and we know a right angle as 90 degrees. So when our angle moves from the initial arm and that terminal arm goes right up until 90 degrees, we know that it forms a right angle. And we know that a right angle is represented by that block over there where the initial arm and the terminal arm intersect. So that vertex there, that's where that 90 degrees is indicated. So let's talk about the acute angles. So an acute angle is measuring more than 0 degrees and less than 90 degrees. So any angle that is more than 0 degrees, so we know that the 0 degrees would be at that point there, and that being the terminal arm. If it is less than 90 degrees, so we can see that the 90 degrees comes there. So if an angle is less than 90 degrees but more than 0 degrees, then we say that that angle is an acute angle. And we can see that there are more examples of this acute angle. It is more than 0 degrees but less than 90 degrees. So as long as it's more than 0 degrees but less than 90 degrees, then we call that angle an acute angle. What about if the angle is more than 90 degrees? So as we can see there, an example of an obtuse angle is one that is measuring more than 90 degrees but less than 180 degrees. So if it's more than 90 degrees but less than 180 degrees, then we call that an obtuse angle. So we can see that the 0 degrees is over there. Our angle goes way past 90 degrees, and because it goes past 90 degrees, then we know that that is an obtuse angle. Of course, we need to make sure that it does not pass our 180 degrees. So we know that the 180 degrees is over there. So from 0 degrees right up until before the 180 degrees, but more than the 90 degrees, then we can call that an obtuse angle. And there is another example of an obtuse angle. As long as it is less than 180 degrees, but more than 90 degrees, then we call that an obtuse angle. Let's look at the keywords that we are going to be working with in this lesson. So we are going to be working with an adjacent angle. So these are angles that share a vertex and an arm. So those are adjacent angles, angles that share a vertex and an arm. Then we are going to look at vertically opposite angles. That is the opposite angles that are formed when two lines intersect each other. They share a vertex and lie on opposite sides of the common vertex. So that would be vertically opposite angles. Then we have complementary angles. That is a pair of angles that add up to 90 degrees. And then lastly, we have those supplementary angles. That is a pair of angles that add up to 180 degrees. So these are the keywords that we are going to be working with within this lesson. Let's quickly go to an ad break and then we'll see you just now.